You're kneeling in sand so hot it burns through skin and thought alike. Your knees throb. The iron collar around your neck bites tighter every time you swallow. So you stop trying. A chain runs from that collar to the woman beside you, and then to the next, and the next, 11 others bound into a single, shuffling body. You can hear them breathing. One is crying softly, as if afraid the sound itself will be punished. Another is praying in a language you don't understand. You recognize fear anyway. Fear doesn't need translation. A shadow falls across your face. For half a heartbeat, the sun eases, then hands take your jaw. Fingers force your mouth open. They press against your teeth, your gums, the back of your throat. You gag. The man doesn't stop. He lifts your lip, peers into your eyes, checks your tongue as if searching for rot. You are examined the way a horse is examined before sale, because that is what you are now. Livestock. Inventory. 12 days ago, you were someone's daughter. The daughter of a village chief in the Sahel. You woke to the sound of your mother calling your name. The smell of cooking fires. The rhythm of a place that knew you. 12 days ago, that life still existed. Then men came before dawn. You watched your mother die. You learned quickly what the men with swords meant when they said keep walking. Stop, and you would join her. In Arabic, there is a word for what you have become. Jariya. It is often translated as slave girl, but that translation is too clean, too gentle. It hides what the word actually meant in practice. It meant your body was now merchandise. Your future belonged to whoever paid for it. Your past, your name, your family, your village no longer existed. The man steps back. He nods to another holding a leather pouch. Coins change hands. You don't know the amount. You only know this is the third time you have been sold this month. And the place they are taking you next is somewhere historians would spend centuries trying not to look at too closely. This is the Arab slave trade. It moved at least 14 million Africans. Some estimates reach 17 million. It lasted more than 1,300 years. And it was so effective at erasing people that almost no descendants remain to tell the story. You've heard of the Atlantic slave trade. Ships crossing the ocean, chains in dark holds. Plantations in the Americas, roughly 12 million Africans transported over 4 centuries. That history has museums, memorials, films, entire school curricula. Politicians speak about it. Nations argue over its legacy. In the United States alone, 45 million people of African descent live as undeniable evidence of what happened. But there was another trade, older, longer, in some ways, more comprehensive. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century. Shortly after the rise of Islam and the rapid Arab conquests across North Africa and the Middle East. It did not end in the Middle Ages. It did not end in the early modern period. It staggered on into the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially abolished slavery in 1962. Mauritania did not do so until 1981. These are not ancient dates. These are dates your grandparents remember. Between roughly 650 AD and 1900 AD. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and moved north and east across the Sahara, down the Nile, across the Red Sea, into North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. Records were inconsistent. Deaths along the way were rarely counted. Many historians believe the true numbers will never be known. What we do know is this: more people were taken over a longer period of time, across routes that stretched over 3 continents, and yet today, in those regions, there are almost no visible descendants. A few small Afro-Arab communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a few thousand people in Morocco, tiny remnants where there should be millions. So, where did 14 million people go? That question sits at the center of this story, and the answer is the darkest part of it. This system was not only about labor, it was about control, and more than that, it was about ensuring that those who were enslaved could never form a future beyond their usefulness. It was designed not merely to exploit human beings, but to remove them from history entirely. The man who bought you doesn't ask your name. He doesn't care. Whatever you were called before has no value now. You will be renamed. Renaming is efficient. It signals ownership. It severs memory. By the time you arrive at your next destination, the sound of your original name may already feel like it belonged to someone else. This is why the silence matters. In the Atlantic world, descendants remember because they exist. Their presence forces remembrance. Their struggles, their cultures, their demands for equality keep history alive. In the regions that absorbed millions through the Arab slave trade, there is no such demographic reminder. The absence itself becomes evidence. not of innocence, but of a system that worked exactly as intended. Historians once struggled with this. Early European scholars asked how a trade of such scale could leave so little trace. They searched for lost populations, hidden communities, missing genealogies. Over time, the truth emerged from court records, travel accounts, religious rulings, and merchant logs, piece by piece. The design revealed itself. This was not accidental erasure. It was structural. Men and women were not taken for the same reasons. They were processed differently, valued differently, destroyed differently. What happened to the men ensured that almost none would leave descendants. What happened to the women ensured that any children they bore would disappear into other populations, their origins blurred and eventually forgotten. You, kneeling in the sand, are at the beginning of that process. You don't know yet what kind of buyer has purchased you. A wealthy merchant, a government official, an agent buying on behalf of someone else. That distinction will decide whether you end up in a modest household or behind guarded walls in a city you've never heard of. It will decide how closely you are watched, how much of your language you are allowed to keep, how quickly your old self is punished out of you. For now, you are only aware of the chain tugging forward. The women beside you stumble as one body. The market noise fades behind you. Another transaction completed, another life folded into a system that has been running for centuries, polished by repetition, protected by normalcy. This trade did not rely on chaos. It relied on order, on routines, on paperwork and pricing and predictable routes. It relied on people who woke each morning and went to work moving human beings the way grain or salt was moved. People who told themselves it was simply how the world worked. And it worked because it left almost nothing behind. By the time historians began to seriously examine this trade, many of its victims had already vanished without descendants, without graves, without names in any surviving record. What remained were numbers, scattered accounts, and a silence so complete it seemed intentional. The woman kneeling in the sand, your stand-in, your witness, will never appear in any archive. No one wrote down what she laughed at. No one recorded the sound of her voice. All that survives is the system that consumed her and moved on, perfectly prepared to do it again. This is where the story begins. The disappearance of 14 million people was not an accident of history. It was not the result of poor record-keeping or the passage of time. It was the outcome of deliberate choices made again and again over centuries, refined until erasure became routine. The men were the first problem the system solved. Across the Arab slave trade, African males were overwhelmingly destined for castration. This is not speculation or exaggeration. It appears repeatedly in legal opinions, travel accounts, merchant correspondence, and administrative records spanning more than 1,000 years. Historians estimate that between 80 and 90% of enslaved African men were castrated before reaching final markets. The procedure was rarely performed at the destination. It happened along the routes, at specific points where suffering could be contained and losses absorbed. Egypt became infamous for this. Certain monasteries, particularly Coptic Christian ones, developed reputations as castration centers. Monks refined techniques intended to improve survival. Improve is a relative term. Even under the best conditions, survival was uncertain. For every man who lived through the operation, 3 to 5 others died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some sources suggest the ratio was even worse. The screams did not matter. The deaths were factored into the cost. If a trader needed 100 living eunuchs to sell at market, he did not capture 100 men. He captured 400 or 500. The excess were expected to die. The logic was brutal, but it was consistent. Castrated men could not reproduce. They could not establish families. They could not build communities strong enough to resist. They aged, worked, and died in isolation, to be replaced by the next shipment of captives. No sons, no grandsons. No one left behind to remember them. This was how a population vanished without leaving descendants. The men who survived castration were sold as guards, servants, administrators, and caretakers, particularly in elite households where access to women was tightly controlled. Eunuchs guarded harems, bull-managed estates, and enforced the system that had destroyed them. Their loyalty was purchased with survival. Their power existed only so long as they remained useful. But the women served a different purpose entirely. Where the male body was neutralized, the female body was preserved, not out of mercy, out of calculation. Women were kept intact, kept fertile, because of what their bodies could produce: labor, pleasure, and children. Historical records rarely describe this directly. Writers used euphemism, silence, vague phrases about service and domestic arrangements. But the reality is unmistakable when read closely. The system required a constant supply of women, and it required them young. Traders developed precise preferences. Girls too young were a burden, years of feeding before usefulness. Women too old brought diminished returns. The ideal age range fell roughly between 13 and 25, old enough to survive the journey, young enough for decades of exploitation. Appearance mattered. Markets had tastes. Certain regions were prized above others. Ethiopian women, in particular, commanded premium prices across nearly all markets. Contemporary sources repeatedly describe their features as especially desirable. They might sell for double or triple the price of women from other regions. Traders knew this. They protected valuable captives during transport, not from compassion, but because damaged merchandise sold poorly. The trade itself was not run by raiders in the desert. Arab merchants were businessmen. They operated vast commercial networks that stretched from West Africa to the Indian Ocean, from the Sahel to Constantinople. They rarely attacked villages themselves. Instead, they built systems that encouraged Africans to capture and sell other Africans. Goods flowed south, firearms, often European-made and traded through Arab intermediaries. Textiles, metal goods, salt, precious in sub-Saharan regions. In exchange, human beings flowed north and east. Entire African states were reshaped around this demand. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, became one of the most prolific suppliers. Its economy depended on annual slave raids against neighboring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled East African routes and transformed the island into a clearinghouse for human cargo. The Fungi Sultanate dominated the Nile corridor. Tuareg confederations controlled trans-Saharan passages, taxing and escorting caravans across the desert. Wars were no longer fought for land. They were fought for people. The cycle fed itself endlessly. More guns enabled more successful raids. More raids produced more captives. More captives increased purchasing power. Increased purchasing power bought more guns. A self-reinforcing machine that converted violence into profit and profit into more violence. When villages were attacked, it was done with efficiency. Dawn assaults when resistance was weakest. Settlements surrounded while people slept. Men who resisted were killed immediately. Men who surrendered were evaluated on the spot. Age, or health, strength, young, strong men were separated for castration. Older men, considered poor investments, were often killed where they stood. Women and girls were subjected to different calculations. Traders examined them carefully, assessing age, body, and perceived desirability. Families were torn apart at these collection points. Mothers ripped from children, husbands from wives, sisters from brothers. The separations happened quickly. Speed prevented resistance. Speed reduced chaos. European missionaries and explorers who witnessed these moments struggled to describe them. Some accounts speak of screaming so intense it seemed to tear the air itself. Mothers clinging to children until soldiers pried their fingers loose. Husbands dragged away, while wives collapsed in the dust. One missionary wrote that the sounds followed him for decades, that he heard them in his dreams long after leaving Africa. Those screams echoed for 1,300 years, and almost no one outside the continent heard them. Once sorted, the captives were chained and marched toward the great routes north. For many, death would come quickly. For others, it would come later. For the women who survived, something worse awaited. Not immediate death, but the systematic dismantling of identity. You were no longer someone who belonged to a family. You were inventory moving through a supply chain, a commodity being preserved just well enough to reach market. The machine did not need hatred to function. It needed indifference, routine, men who counted profits, guards who followed orders, buyers who asked prices instead of names. Over centuries, this indifference hardened into tradition. Tradition hardened into normality. By the time the chains pulled forward and the long march began, the system had already decided your fate. Not your individual fate, that would vary, but the fate of anyone like you. You would leave no trace strong enough to survive the centuries. No community, no lineage, no memory preserved by descendants. The desert was waiting to finish the work. Then came the Sahara, for those chained into the caravans. The desert was not simply a landscape to cross. It was an instrument of death, as essential to the trade as the chains and the men who carried whips. The trans-Saharan routes were measured not in miles but in bodies. From the collection points of sub-Saharan Africa to the great markets of North Africa, Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, Marrakesh, caravans traveled distances that could exceed 2,000 miles. Picture the span from New York to Denver, crossed on foot, in irons, with almost no water, under a sun that kills. The journey took 2 to 3 months under what traders called good conditions. Those conditions almost never existed. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Daytime temperatures routinely climb above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand becomes so hot, it burns exposed skin on contact. There is no shade for days at a time. Then night falls, and the temperature collapses. The same desert that scorched you by day could drop below freezing after dark. The human body is not built for such extremes. Thousands died simply from the shock of it. Water governed everything. It was the most valuable resource in the caravan, and it was rationed with ruthless precision. Camels drank first. Camels were expensive. Camels carried goods. Without camels, the trade collapsed. Enslaved people came last. They were cheaper, replaceable. They received whatever water remained after the animals drank, which was often barely enough to wet cracked lips. Thirst hollowed people from the inside out. Tongues swelled. Lips split and bled. Thoughts narrowed to a single obsession: water. Some captives licked condensation from cold metal at night. Others sucked moisture from cloth or sand, knowing it would not help. There was always the awareness that hundreds of miles of burning emptiness still lay ahead. Food was little better. Dried dates. Sometimes a bit of meat. Enough calories to force legs to keep moving. Never enough to maintain strength over weeks of walking. Bodies weakened. Illness spread. Wounds from shackles festered. Those who collapsed were rarely helped. Stopping cost money. Every delay risked the lives of animals and the loss of profit. The economics did not support compassion. People who could no longer walk were left where they fell. Some were already dead. Others were alive, sitting upright in the sand, too weak to stand, watching the caravan disappear. No one came back. Historians estimate that 20 to 30% of enslaved people died during Saharan crossings. Some caravans lost half their human cargo. There are documented cases where losses exceeded 60%. These were not disasters in the eyes of traders. They were acceptable attrition. As the years passed, the routes themselves became marked by death. Bones accumulated along paths used generation after generation. Skeletons were not buried. Burial slowed the caravan. The desert kept what it was given. European explorers who crossed the Sahara in the 19th century described scenes that haunted them. Heinrich Barth wrote of trails literally strewn with skeletons. In some valleys, bones were so numerous that one could hardly avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun lay half buried in drifting sand, rib cages protruding like broken fences. René Caillet documented similar horrors along western routes. From a distance, some valleys appeared pale, almost white, not from sand, but from accumulated bones. Gustave Nachtigal described regions where skulls and femurs gave the ground an almost paved quality underfoot. These were not ancient remains. They were recent additions to paths that had been collecting bodies for over 1,000 years. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions over 13 centuries, died along these routes. Their remains were scattered across the largest desert on Earth, silently marking the paths that consumed them. There were no markers, no names, just bone and sand, enduring long after memory failed. For the women who survived, who endured thirst, heat, cold, hunger, and the constant knowledge that collapse meant abandonment, reaching North Africa did not mean safety. It only meant that the immediate dying had paused. Many arrived physically alive, but psychologically shattered. They had watched others die daily. They had learned that pain could last without end. Whatever sense of self they carried from their villages had been worn thin by months of degradation and fear. Their bodies arrived. Their spirits often did not. Ports and cities rose out of the desert like mirages. Cairo, Tripoli, Tunis, markets that had operated for centuries, refined by repetition. To the traders, these were destinations. To the captives, they were thresholds into something else. The slave markets of the Arab world were not chaotic scenes of cruelty. They were orderly, efficient, structured by category and price. Cairo's market had functioned continuously for over 1,000 years by the time European observers began documenting it. Generations of traders had perfected the rituals of evaluation and sale. Buyers came from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy households from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf seeking domestic servants. Even Europeans, despite official prohibitions, found ways to participate quietly. Markets were divided by function. Laborers in one section, skilled workers in another, domestic servants elsewhere, and behind screens. In more secluded spaces, the women intended for private sale. Those women were shielded not for dignity, but to preserve exclusivity. The examination process began immediately. Teeth were checked first. Dental health revealed age and overall condition. Experienced buyers could estimate remaining years of usefulness from teeth alone. Skin was examined for disease, scars, imperfections. Hair was assessed for texture and length. Then the rest of the body. European travelers struggled to describe what they saw. Some accounts were censored by publishers unwilling to print the details. One British observer in the 1830s wrote that the women were made to walk, to turn, to display themselves in ways that could not be described in polite company. The buyers examined them with the same cold calculation used to evaluate livestock. Prices varied. Common women sold for modest sums. Women with desirable features commanded much more. Young virgins from preferred regions could sell for the equivalent of several years' wages. The highest prices were often paid privately by agents representing the wealthiest households. Zanzibar became the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean world. At its height, as many as 50,000 enslaved people passed through the island annually. The entire economy revolved around human beings. David Livingstone witnessed the trade there firsthand. What he saw changed him permanently. He wrote that to exaggerate its evils was impossible, that the scenes he witnessed were so revolting he tried to drive them from memory. The market officially closed in 1873 under British pressure. The Sultan signed a treaty. Auctions ended in public view, but the trade did not stop. It slipped underground. Ships sailed at night. Sales occurred in hidden courtyards. The demand remained. The profits remained. And where demand exists, supply adapts. For the women sold there, survival had delivered them into a new phase of erasure. The desert had stripped them physically. The market would finish the work on their identity. What happened next depended entirely on who bought them. What happened after the sale depended entirely on who claimed ownership. And wealth determined everything. The richest buyers were not looking for labor alone. They were building harems, institutions that modern language reduces to caricature, but which in reality were complex. Enclosed worlds governed by hierarchy, surveillance, and power. Ottoman sultans maintained harems numbering in the hundreds, sometimes thousands. At its height, the imperial harem at Topkapi Palace in Constantinople housed as many as 2,000 women at once. Provincial governors kept smaller versions. Wealthy merchants owned a handful. Even men of modest means might possess one or two women as domestic servants with additional, unspoken obligations. The harem was not simply a space for physical access. It was a political institution. Women competed for favor, because favor meant protection. Bearing a son to a powerful man could transform everything. The mother of a future ruler wielded influence that rivaled ministers. Alliances formed. Rivalries hardened. Poison became a tool. Court politics unfolded behind locked doors, with the same intensity found in council chambers. For a woman captured from Africa, entry into a harem meant the systematic destruction of her former self. She was given a new name. Her language was forbidden. Her religion was replaced. Trainers instructed her in how to walk, how to speak, how to obey. Punishment followed mistakes swiftly. Over time, memory itself became dangerous. To survive, she learned to forget. A few women navigated this world with extraordinary skill. Kosum Sultan rose from enslavement to dominate Ottoman politics for decades. Hurrem Sultan became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an almost unthinkable elevation for a former slave. History remembers their names precisely because they were anomalies. Their stories survived because they intersected with power, for every one of them. Thousands of others lived and died in anonymity, used until their youth faded, discarded when they no longer held value. Their lives ended quietly, without record. Women sold to less wealthy buyers faced different realities, but not kinder ones. Many became domestic servants, cooking, cleaning, raising children, while remaining perpetually available to their owners. Consent did not exist. Refusal was not an option. Islamic law offered limited theoretical protections, but enforcement varied widely. A slave woman who bore her master's child became known as an walad, a mother of a child. She could no longer be sold. Her child was born free when her master died. She was to gain her freedom. On paper, this offered a path out. In practice, it offered nothing before pregnancy, and no guarantee afterward, until she conceived. She was property. Even then, abuse continued. Freedom depended on a man's death. Children born from these unions often entered society, acknowledged and legally free. Some rose to prominence. Multiple rulers were sons of enslaved women, but their mothers remained enslaved unless explicitly freed. And over generations, these children married into broader Arab populations. Features blended, languages vanished. Stories were not passed down. African origins faded until they were invisible. This was the final erasure, not the destruction of bodies, but the dissolution of lineage, not murder, but absorption so complete that nothing recognizable remained. There was no dramatic end to this trade, no single declaration, no war fought to abolish it. It faded slowly, reluctantly, under pressure from outside forces rather than internal reckoning. British naval patrols closed East African routes in the late 19th century. European colonial administrations disrupted trans-Saharan networks. Treaties were signed. Laws were passed, but enforcement lagged. Underground markets flourished for decades. Demand does not vanish quietly. By the time slavery was formally abolished across much of the Islamic world in the 20th century, most of its victims were already gone in the only way that truly matters to history. They had left no descendants who could insist on remembrance. The legacy is not monuments or museums. It is absence. In 2020, archaeologists in Libya uncovered a mass grave, hundreds of remains. Analysis showed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century, almost certainly enslaved people who collapsed during the crossing and were left behind. They had no names in any record, no descendants to claim them, no one who knew they had ever lived. Just bones in the desert, the Atlantic slave trade left 45 million descendants who ensure its history cannot be ignored. This trade left silence. 14 million people erased so completely that we do not know their names. The woman whose teeth were examined, whose body was priced, whose humanity was stripped away inspection by inspection. We will never know what her mother called her. The names spoken in childhood, the songs she learned, the stories she carried. She might have ended in a Cairo household competing for attention. She might have cooked and cleaned in Baghdad. She might have faded into a palace corner in Istanbul when her youth passed. She might have borne children who never learned her language, never knew her songs, never knew where she came from. Or she might have died in the desert, her bones joining millions of others, marking routes civilization chose to forget. What we know is this: she existed, she suffered, and for 1,300 years, millions like her fed a machine designed to consume them completely. There are no holidays for them, no memorials, no days of remembrance, only sand-covering bones no one can identify. Remember her not as a statistic. Remember her as someone's daughter, someone who laughed once, someone who had a name before it was erased. That may be the only memorial they will ever receive.